It is Friday, March 31st, 2023, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I'm John Robinson, and I'm here with my podcast partner and co-host, Mr. Wallace G. Smith. How are we doing this Friday afternoon, Mr. Smith?
Doing wonderfully, actually. It's nice to be at the end of the week. Looking forward to the Sabbath. Doing great.
Exactly. We've slowly morphed into doing all the podcasts on Friday.
That was not our intention, but and things are busy. We have an exciting new booklet coming out. There's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on. Okay, what do we have on tap for this afternoon, Mr. Smith?
Our topic, which we'll jump into here in just a moment, and I know it's going to be profitable as the days of unleavened bread are breathing down our necks. We are going to talk about blame, putting the blame on others, and take a look at just how that affects us.
And how it's a great idea.
We'll see. Stay tuned.
All right, sounds good. Let's do it.
The days of unleavened bread and Passover are on their way. And I think we mentioned it last time, Mr. Robinson. I can't recall that we did want to do at least one or two podcast meet and do season preparing for the days coming up. And so welcome all of you who are here listening to the podcast with those days coming for you as well. It's wonderful to be here in Charlotte, and I hear the printer outside in the hall busy doing. What is it actually working on?
I think it's printing the weekly Charlotte Bulletin.
Oh, great. Okay, for local work. Well, the topic today about blame, and we're not married to a title. Of course, if you've seen this already, you're listening to this, you know what the title is. We thought about the poison of blame, the how blame poisons your mind. The word poison keeps coming up, but
the common denominator seems to be poison and blame.
It is. And I'm a little sensitive because Mr. Robinson has noted a few of my titles recently that have struck him as a bit, how do I put it? Kind of head scratchers. Are like, huh? What? That's the title?
Well, there were a couple where later when I see them posted, I thought, that's how is that what we talked about? Like the most recent one, I won't even say which one. I did say the most recent one.
You said the most recent one, that's right. Sweet, unleavened meditations, right?
I texted Mr. Smith and I said, what does that even mean?
And I said, because they're sweet. I mean, they're really good. So anyway, so this one, well, you'll see what the title is, and you can let us know from the future. But part of why we're talking about it, actually, I want to give some credit to my wife. We were chatting, I don't know, I think it was before the last podcast, but we were talking about what blame, that is, when I say what is blame, well, we'll actually get into a few more examples, but this idea of putting off on others, the idea that, well, yes, I did this wrong thing, but it's that other person's fault. Or maybe, no, I'm not in the wrong because of that other person's actions. That kind of idea of blaming somebody else. My wife and I just had a great conversation concerning how that impacts your mind and how it causes you to think, and how it prevents you from thinking helpful things you really should think. And I just thought, this is perfect for the days of unleavened bread, I think, with them coming up, and the whole theme of Passover and unleavened bread, which is self-examination.
When you mentioned that topic and then told me it was your wife's idea, my first thought was absolutely not. But no, it totally was not. I thought, man, that is a good topic idea, because I had to learn some hard lessons when I was younger, and I found I really had fallen into a trap of having a lot of excuses for why things were going the way they were in my life, and those meditations did not include me as the core of the problem. So, if we can talk about this topic today and help somebody who's younger and navigating on their way to becoming an adult or a young adult, the importance of recognizing your role in problems in your life.
You're making me feel better. This is like a little bit of therapy. You're making me feel better about myself, at least in terms of a shared concern or shared mistake. I used to also be the same when I was young. The idea that I didn't want to be seen as someone who had done something wrong. And I didn't recognize until I was, I would say, really a good bit older, might even early when I started to have kids, and they would be in a place and not want to take credit for the wrong, and me trying to highlight it in them. Maybe that's when I started to see it more intensely in terms of what I had built as a practice in my life. But yeah, it was very important to me that others see me as the good guy who doesn't make mistakes or doesn't do this or that, and then recognizing, well, I'm lying. Actually, that's a lie. It's not putting your best foot forward if it's not even your foot. But also, I was missing out, and we'll kind of get it to this. I was also missing out on really the benefits that come from actually just owning the truth and actually embracing that and learning to have a real relationship with people based on reality and not based on the constant feeling that I'm making sure no one knows I actually did make a mistake or do something wrong. And so, yeah, knowing that you went through similar kinds of things is reassuring.
Well, I don't want to immediately derail our topic, but I think this might be relevant. So this is insight into actual conversations Mr. Smith and I have. And one of the phrases we use commonly is the idea of model building. Our goal truly, we'll see if you cut this out of the podcast.
When
but,
I edit, we'll see. I can't wait to hear it.
Mr. Weston, when he became the presiding evangelist, we tried hard to build an accurate model about Mr. Weston because it is our job to respond to him, and he's leading and guiding the church. And so, well, what's important to him and what's not? When does he want us to just take action and just get it done?
Right.
And when does he want to be brought in to be asked questions or give us directions? And so what you were talking about earlier was the importance of building accurate models in your lives. Build an accurate model of your spouse, build an accurate model of your siblings, and your life will just be better if you're just realistic about who the other people are, but also yourself. It's very difficult to build an accurate model of yourself, but it is possible, and especially if you have God helping you through His Holy Spirit.
The word, it sounds so technical, to build a model of someone, but part of why I put it that way is just my math background. You're trying to create a model of reality so you can try to understand what to expect or what the nature of a system is. But I do increasingly, and I have now for some time, applied that to people in my lives, recognizing, especially when it's someone you're responsible to. When I was an actuary, my boss had expectations, but there's times I've got to make decisions, and she wasn't around to ask. I didn't know, and so that doesn't mean just act willy-nilly on what you want to do. I had to think, okay, what, the model of her that I've built in my mind in terms of what the decisions she makes and what matters to her, because I haven't actually checked in this particular case, how does that inform me in making my decision so I can feel that much more comfortable this is what she would want me to do. So,
yep.
But yeah, and to a certain extent, that's kind of what I was trying to do in trying to deflect to other things as the cause of whatever problem when I was young, that it wasn't me. It certainly wasn't me. It was this over there. This is, I'm trying in a sense to shape the other person's model of me to make sure it doesn't include, oh yeah, sometimes Wally does a wrong thing. Sometimes Wally makes a bad call. Because who wants that to be? But you know what? That actually is reality. And marriage has helped me to teach that. We really are kind of jumping to some of the benefits at the end. Is it actually benefits my relationship with my wife for her to know me more accurately,
right,
and to recognize, yeah, he's not great at this, or this, as opposed to trying to help her have this huge false image of me, which then is not reliable. Suddenly her model of me is inaccurate, and she's going to expect me to follow through when it comes to cleaning such and such for unleavened bread, versus no, it's not going to happen. We're going to have to scramble at the end to get it taken care of.
You know what the Jewish tradition is? And it's funny that you've admitted that, like, you have to push yourself to contribute more to de-leavening the household. Same over here.
Really?
And so apparently there's a Jewish tradition where the wife will hide a piece of leaven somewhere in the house so that it's dad's job to go find it so that he can.
So that she knows. That's actually that's fascinating. Okay.
Well, yeah.
So let's jump into it.
No shortage of examples of people not wanting to take responsibility for their actions. And when I say I love it, that might not be exactly the best way to put it, but I think it's so fundamental to us and our being that it's embedded in the first story in the Bible.
Yeah, blaming other people happens at the very,
Yep.
very beginning. I don't know if do you have those scriptures up, Mr. Robinson? If not,
I
I'm
do.
about to pull them up. Okay, great.
I don't have, I only have Adam's here because that's what I like to riff off the most. But um, Eve herself does not exactly take responsibility for her actions either.
Oh, that's right. It is definitely a blame passing chain. Why don't you start with Adam and I'll go with
Okay.
Eve.
All right.
So in Genesis 3, for those.
So Genesis 3. Now, we're going to assume that most of the audience is familiar with this story, but let's recall that God has created Adam. Well, first God created. I think the sequence is important without this turning into like a Genesis Bible study.
Right.
But what's created first? Adam's created first, and then he's put into a garden with 2 trees, and Eve has not been created yet. So the instructions concerning the 2 trees are passed along to Adam, and it is his responsibility. I think this is a core thing to understand for this whole story. Part of Adam's the delinquency in doing his duties revolves around the fact that he does not do his job regarding the instructions of the 2 trees. But they're in the garden. They're together. Go read the account again, and you'll see it. They're together. They're standing by the tree. The snake comes up and deceives them. So a couple of things that
Deceives
are facts.
her.
Right. Oh,
right.
yeah. Yes. That is a key element. You're right.
I mean, she might use the pronoun them. Not back then.
That's good.
Not back then.
But, right. Eve is deceived and Adam is not. And I think it's in Timothy, it makes that quite clear. Does that sound right?
Yeah, Paul, I know it's definitely Paul makes
does
the point.
So, at least in the story, you do have some circumstances that Eve could say, you know what, hey, I was deceived, and and my husband didn't leap to my defense, which he didn't. But Adam was not deceived, and when God knows that this has happened, and then they fall in, and he calls for an accounting, Genesis 3 and verse 11, and this is God, and he said, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I have commanded you that you shall not eat?" Now, carefully note Adam's response. The man said, "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I ate." So there's 2 things embedded in there. One, he blames Eve, and then really he also blames God because, hey, you gave her to me. So
the ultimate blaming.
Yep.
That's right. He doesn't own it. He doesn't say, you're right, I did. Because God asked him, have you eaten? Of course, he knows, but have you eaten? Adam didn't say, yes. Kind of like the old story, which apparently is apocryphal, but was meant to be a reflection of George Washington's great character, first president of the United States, where he chops down a cherry tree. And his father asks him, did you chop down the cherry tree? And he's, I cannot tell a lie. Yes, I did. I know that I've seen pictures of it where even young guys got like an axe standing next to the tree. It's like, well, maybe he just knew he was busted. But in this case, Adam doesn't say, "Oh, yes, sir, I did. I've sinned. I've done." But immediately, the first words says the man said, "The woman." I mean, the very first words out of his mouth is he passes the buck as if it's Eve's fault, not his. But you're spot on, Mr. Robinson. It's not just the woman, she gave me of the tree and I ate, but the woman whom you gave to be with me. What are you doing, God, giving me a faulty woman? So absolutely passing the buck.
So I have a shame story.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, in case there's new listeners, shame story is kind of a technical framing.
It's a Brene Brown kind of thing.
It's
that
an
Mr.
old
Robinson,
story you're not proud of, but you'll tell it because
something to be benefited from the telling. Sure.
And I've told this story a few times, and I don't think I've told it on the podcast. If I have, my apologies. But so
y'all hit the 30-second forward button if you need to on your app.
So the reason this story hit me probably 10, 15 years ago was so I was 25 when I was married. And at the beginning of my marriage, because this would have been in the mid-90s, there still was a lot of pressure on marriages, which actually it's even gotten worse since then. This idea of 50-50, that a marriage is 50-50. Now, Mr. Ames will quickly tell you that is a fallacy. A marriage is 100%, 100%. Okay, that's exactly right. But the worldly idea of 50-50 was we would split duties, split decision-making. It's kind of this partnership. And so there was this one time my wife and I had some fairly major decision to make, and I do not remember what it was, but it doesn't really matter. and we were debating it, and I was pressing her on what her thought and her idea was and what decision she thought we should make. And I could tell it was pressure. It was stressing her.
Hmm.
And I kept pressuring her. And then it hit me. I do not know what triggered this realization, but the realization, and not proud of this. This is why it's my shame story. Was I realized in an instant that the reason that I wanted my wife to make the decision was so that if it didn't work out, I could blame her.
Really? Like
Yep.
that realization?
Oh yeah, no,
came
and
to
I
you.
knew it was the cold stark truth.
That's a painful moment.
And you know, it didn't hurt me that long because it actually spurred me to action. Like I was like, no, I do not, because at the end of the day, as this story brings out. In fact, if we read more of this, it would be quite clear, because as Adam, or God, when he's heard all the testimony, as it were, he says to Adam, because you heeded the voice of your wife.
Right.
That was not her call. It was his responsibility to protect her
Right.
from the deception. And so I took that seriously in my life, and I kind of had this idea of it doesn't work this way as far as we know, but you know, it's the end of my life and I'm having this exit interview with Jesus Christ, and he's asking me about some decisions I made. How do you think Jesus Christ would respond when I told him, "Oh, no, my wife made that decision"?
Yeah, I didn't make that call.
Yeah, no.
He's going to say,
I didn't like it anyway when she. I
he's
told
going
her
to
this
say,
is
really,
never gonna
Robinson?
work. Yep.
6,000 years later, I'm still hearing noise like this from men.
I spent the next 20. This is not an exaggeration. 20 years of my marriage making sure that wouldn't happen.
Man.
And don't take it the wrong way, ladies or anybody out there. I want my wife's input. I value her input, and I want to make a decision that takes into account her concerns and her needs. But at the end of the day, a hard decision is mine.
Yeah.
And I was willing, and still am, to fully embrace the responsibility that is. It's not, some people get caught up with like, oh, I'm in charge, and you know, all the perks of that. I don't view it that way hardly at all. It is a responsibility. God tasked me with the responsibility of protecting my wife and my children, and he holds me accountable for the family decisions and not my wife. And so that's part of why I like this story and what I get out of it. And Adam represents all of us. That's kind of, we want to blame somebody else for the problem.
Yeah, fantastic. As opposed to owning it. And that's part of the theme we'll want to have at the end is as opposed to a spirit of blame, there is a great deal of power to be had in owning it. Now, for Eve's part, she also, it's not like she ones up her husband in this regard. It says in verse 13, after Adam's response, that the eternal God said to the woman, "What is this you have done?" And the woman said, "The serpent deceived me." If I was going to do Eve, I should.
It's
Okay.
worth it.
I'm not going to do that. So the woman said, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." So she doesn't take accountability either. You know, she said, "Oh no, I was deceived," and that's important to recognize too. It's still factual. I mean, what have they said that isn't factual?
Right.
What did Adam say in verse 12? The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me of the tree and I ate. He's not lying. He's not saying something false, but he's clearly using these true statements to shift the blame away from him. Same thing. The serpent literally, that is the devil through this serpent, literally did deceive Eve. But she's not owning her role in allowing that to happen, because it does make plain when you tie it in with what John says later in 1 John, that there's the appeal, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. As it describes when she makes the choice, that she still knows what God's command is, and she knows that the fruit is appealing. Maybe the devil deceived her about dying, possibly, but regardless, she still made a conscious choice to not do what God said. But here's the thing I want to highlight before we move away from Adam and Eve. Well, actually, two things. One is, so Adam passes the blame to Eve and God.
Mm-hmm.
Eve then takes that blame and passes it on to the devil. Well, here's the thing. Do you think the devil even cares? It's like,
I think his response was, ha ha.
So Nelson Muntz
Yes.
now as the devil. So the devil doesn't care if you want to blame him. He doesn't care at all if you want to blame him. He's happy to take the blame. What he wants is the end result, which is you are sinful, you're broken. That's all he really cares about, because whether he takes the blame or not is not going to change his fate. He wants to corrupt God's plans, destroy them in your life. And hey, in fact, it even helps his plan for you to blame him, because it means you're not owning it. And as we'll talk about later, you're not going to be addressing the problems. You're busy putting the blame on him. And I would suspect he's tickled pink anytime. I'm sure what Adam and Eve did, passing the buck like that, I'm sure he was grinning from ear to ear, or whatever would be the appropriate indication of the devil being pleased.
You should query Midjourney and see what that picture would look like. One thing that you mentioned there as you were going through your thought process that I loved, which was, you kind of touched on it, and Satan. This is something that Satan also would appreciate in the mistakes we've made if we all put ourselves in this position in the Garden of Eden, and that is they did have something of a legitimate excuse for why they did what they did.
Right, the things they said were true. That's right.
Right, but at the end of the day, that they knew that that's not what they were supposed to do. And so if we just rely on our excuses, we kind of rely on, I think you could call it like something, we're deceiving ourselves.
Yeah, we are. I tend to bring this point out around Passover because I feel it's something the church understands that and teaches and sees in the holy days that so many others don't, and it's so important. Adam wasn't wrong in the sense that his wife had a role to play. She did. Mm-hmm. Eve wasn't wrong that the devil didn't have a role to play. He did. And they bear the burdens of that, but it doesn't change their choice. And so it relates to the Day of Atonement to me, because the Day of Atonement, we recognize the devil is sent away, that he does bear the blame, if you will, for his part in our sins. If you look at the symbology, we're not going to take the time with it right now, but you got the two goats. One of the goats pictures actually the devil, and his role in our sins is fully recognized by God, and he will pay that price. However, none of it changes the fact that Christ needed to die for our sins and for our choices, because we still did the things we did. It's when people often, it's like some of the arguments you'll see out there where ladies are, they dress provocatively out in the world. Mm-hmm. They dress provocatively and guys are yelling at them and, all these cat calls and such. And they want to point to those guys' inappropriate behavior. Well, people see it as like the kind of game where, one's got to be guilty and not the other. Like the guys are guilty of being jerks and the lady is completely innocent, or the lady is guilty of dressing that way and so the guys are completely innocent. Believe it or not, everybody can be guilty. You can be guilty for your choice in what to wear, and they can be guilty for being jerks about it. It's like when some young women in the world will say, I should be able to dress however I want. It shouldn't make a difference. Well, let's say as a young woman, if you dress provocatively and a young man sees and lusts, well, he does not have the right before God to blame you, but then you also bear a part of the burden. The way God sees those things is, yes, he still sins. Mm-hmm. He sins in his heart. He is lusting. He could have averted his eyes. He could have done all sorts of things. He will bear the sin of having done that. He'll need to be forgiven through Christ's blood. But it doesn't change the fact that someone did put a stumbling block in front of him, and that person bears their guilt as well. And so Adam and Eve weren't lying. Adam said, the woman gave to me, right? And the woman said, oh, the devil deceived me. Those were all true, and none of them changed the fact that Adam made the choice he did, and Eve made the choice she did. There's enough actual guilt to go around.
Right. Because what's the larger lesson as we go through our life? Well, as we go through our life, many things there are going to happen that are beyond our control. We are going to be tricked sometimes, deceived. Many people make a decision that affect us that we have no control over. And so at the end of the day, what's the only thing we really can control? And that is our response. And so part of that will be, all these things happened, but I can't use that as an excuse for not doing the right thing.
Absolutely. And we'll try to make sure we summarize these points when we get to the end. Let's move from Adam and Eve to their kiddos, in particular Cain. And I think we could probably spend a whole long time on this, but let's try not to. We'll try to control ourselves, because I have to wonder, did Cain learn some of this behavior? I mean, it's too easy to assume some of those things, because Abel didn't necessarily learn the same behavior, or if they did, they were exposed to it Abel overcame it. But regardless, the story of Cain and Abel, I like how you've labeled this. I didn't actually label this in the notes, Mr. Robinson. You did. So why don't you take the football from here?
Oh wow, a little bit of pressure.
I said football because I'm sportsy.
So all right, let's just be upfront. I not only gave a split sermon about Cain, but wrote, what do we call that? Adapted that into an article, and I had a lot of people reach out to me, which I really appreciated, and thank me for the article. But in some ways, I don't even feel like I can take full credit for it, because, as I say in my own article, it's the kind of story that I read over quickly. It's a short
Cain
segment,
and Abel, the story of Cain and Abel.
story of Cain and Abel. And in some ways, I wasn't even sure why it was embedded in there. But that's like the younger John Robinson just not thinking through that. Have you ever considered the possibility that there's an organization and structure to Genesis? And so it did hit me. A couple things hit me. One was there was a particular clinical psychologist from Canada who talked about it a lot, and that's what got my attention. And he thought it was one of the most amazing stories in the Bible. And I thought, well, I should take another look at this story because I'm clearly missing something. And one of the things I realized was, so in the Garden of Eden, you have Adam and Eve, and their interaction is also with Satan, but with God. So it's somewhat as an example of, okay, here's the story of mankind and God in that relationship. And so the very next story in the Bible is really more about two brothers, or your neighbor. And so as we in the church think, and I think this is a great division of the Ten Commandments, the first half of the commandments are how to regulate your relationship with God, and the other half regulate your relationship with your neighbor. And that's a great two-part summary. And so what's the first story? The first story in Genesis talks about our relationship with our Creator, and then the second one is our relationship with our neighbor. And so here you have Cain, and if you really are careful in how you read the story and take into account the other areas, especially where Abel is mentioned, a story emerges where you see Abel just going about his business, being righteous, and Cain slowly but surely, he's not doing what's right. And instead of recognizing Abel is behaving more properly, more righteously, and thinking, hey, I need to live up to that standard and kind of clean up my life.
Yeah, I need to step it up.
Yeah. He drew the opposite conclusion. He was tired of seeing Mr. Goody Two Shoes, Abel over there, and he's, Dr. Peterson, when he talks about the story, is kind of funny. He's a great guy. All the ladies love him.
Is that what he says?
He says something like
funny.
that. And so anyway, like you said, we could turn a whole podcast into Cain and Abel. But what do we see? His attitude continues to fall. He brings God a substandard offering. God warns him that, hey, sin is crouching at your door, but look, if you do well, will you not be accepted? Like he's given an opportunity to clean it up, and he doesn't. And I would argue that part of the reason he ends up killing his brother, well, there's several reasons. One is he's tired of seeing his brother's example that he doesn't measure up to and wants to get rid of it. But I would say one of the other things in there is he just never wanted to accept responsibility for what he did. And the rest of the narrative really brings that out. When after he kills his brother, God calls him to account for it. And not only does he take no responsibility, but this is why we call him, Cain, the ultimate victim.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he kills his brother and his response is still sort of like,
woe is me.
Yeah. God puts a punishment on him that could have been his death and doesn't. He escapes it with his life somehow. My punishment is more than I can bear. This is so unfair. And it's like, meanwhile, Abel literally is not alive. Can we use literally like that?
He was literally not alive. So that, yes, we can. Yes, we can.
So anyway, it's not, if it were only Cain here, but he is sprinkled in through the rest of the Bible as Jude. He's highlighted as like this grouping of three of attitudes that you don't want to be a part of.
Yeah.
And Cain's two things, I would argue. One, he's the way of get. I think Mr. Armstrong, brought that out. Represents the way of get, but also the idea, what it kind of answers the question, what happens if you never take responsibility for anything, blame everybody else for everything, and not only that, but you think the way other people treat you is unfair.
Yeah, it really is. When you labeled him the notes, Cain, the ultimate victim. it is astonishing that just to give my little 2 cents before we move on, because you've put it so well. I'm just going to repeat things you said and then take some credit for also thinking those thoughts.
I take credit for the great editors that help me write my articles.
But he and his brother are doing offerings, and Cain's just isn't up to snuff. He's just not doing things the way he should in his offerings, possibly other things in life. And God actually deigns to point it out to him and to help him out and to say, hey, why's your countenance falling? What's going on in your little noggin there, Cain? He says, well, if you do good too, won't you be accepted? That's his opportunity to own that I'm not doing the right thing. I'm the one that can change it. In fact, I've literally, just like we have Christ living in us if we're baptized to help us, God is actually there to help. God's actually pointing it out to him, and actually helping, showing a willingness to guide him to make things better. But what does he do? He externalizes, nice fancy word in terms of locating something out of yourself. He externalizes the source of his troubles in his brother, and instead of addressing what he needs to do to change, he decides to kill his brother. Like, that's going to take away the problem. And I didn't think about it until the way you put it. And then what is his response when he's punished? Oh, poor me, I'm suffering so much. Your brother lies dead, but you're the one who's suffering, and you're the one who's going through a trial. That's kind of what blame will do in the way it poisons your mind. You don't think of yourself rightly, nor do you think of the people, or as I'll mention in a moment, the circumstances rightly either. Everything is out of proportion and mixed up. A habit of blaming other people, even like in Adam and Eve's case, where maybe the things they were highlighting were certainly true. If we get in that habit of blaming others, it poisons how we view ourselves, where we fail to see the things we need to become better. And also it poisons how we see other people. Here it poisoned his own view of his righteous, good brother, to the point that he actually murdered him. He's called righteous Abel. What if Cain had even reached out to his brother and to say, hey, Abel, my offerings keep falling short, or something? Would Abel have been willing to help? There's nothing to indicate that he wouldn't have been. He's called righteous Abel. It poisoned his view of his brother. It poisoned his view of himself. I would dare say it poisoned his view of God to a great extent. I know we seem to be reading a lot into it, but it's kind of an archetypical story. It's given right here at the foundation of the world, and you're right, is mentioned multiple times in the Bible.
Well, Mr. O'Gwen also brings out that one of the lessons we learned by God allowing Abel to live, because where does the story of Genesis go next? It talks about when I say alternate civilization, I mean, he is separated from everybody else, and he goes and he starts his own family, which grows large and becomes this whole, the sense of it is quite clear there in Genesis. His own alternate civilization, and it ends in the flood.
Yeah.
It's his poisonous, bitter attitude was taken over into a new group of people that started a new civilization, and it ended with God saying, only, every, continually. Their thoughts were on evil. I mean, it was three superlatives of they only think of evil. Let's see. Every thought of their hearts was only evil continually, I believe is how it's phrased.
Wow.
That's what happens when you have a blame victim mentality.
Right. I want to make sure we move to some kind of summarize some of our thinking before we leave. But before I do that, these have been about blaming people. I want to make sure I touch on at least the concept of blaming circumstances all the time. And this will be an element of this will be true, just like it was true for blaming people. We're not necessarily saying that the means by which, or the words with which, or the thoughts with which we would blame someone else or our circumstances are false. They don't have to be false. I think in Cain's view, he was so poisoned, I don't think he saw things rightly at all. And in Adam and Eve's point of view, they saw a truth, but it was a truth they used to avoid other truths that were uncomfortable. Adam used the fact that his wife had given him the fruit as an excuse for avoiding what he really needed to completely own, which was that he made this conscious choice. Well, in terms of circumstances, we can do the same thing. How many of us, I won't say how many people, but I've certainly been there too, why did I fail that algebra test? Oh, well, because I was it was so busy, and
Right.
my favorite movie was in town, and I agreed with my friends, and we're kind of looking at all these circumstances. It's like, well, if only I had not been sick, for those few days, or if only I had done this. Well, all those things might be true, but as we'll talk about later, it really removes from you any sense of agency so you can address things and actually potentially change them. And we are often surrounded by circumstances we wish we were
Right.
not surrounded by. But you know what? We can't control all of those things. And if we're going to plan our steps or make our choices purely based on the circumstances around us, as if our circumstances truly do control us to that extent, then we've virtually given up control of our whole lives, and not to God, but to really the randomness of life that exists around us.
I'm glad you brought that up because you're right. We have focused on blaming other people, but there are plenty of like naturally occurring circumstances that are problem. There's the hazards of telling other people's stories, but that really reminded me of Mr. O'Gwen used an example of an individual. No, he didn't name the individual, of course, that he had known for quite a while. I guess they'd been in the same area for a while, and this he said this individual always had an excuse for why his business wasn't doing well. And he said he hadn't seen him for some time, ran into him again, and this time it was Reaganomics or killing me. If it was the economy, it was the president this time. Some reason that success eluded that person because they always had somebody that they were blaming. Here in a little bit, I'll share a real lesson I had to learn when I was younger, but I'll start off with to exactly to the point of what you were saying, an area in which I learned to stop. It wasn't that I stopped blaming something less. More, I would say I started accepting more that I could do something about it.
Okay.
Was sports. So my first sport that I played, well, really the only sport because football was never realistic that we would play that, but I played basketball. When I was young, I had an aptitude for basketball, loved playing it, played for hours. It probably kept me out of trouble because I would rather play basketball. High school, your friends are going out to parties and getting drunk and other bad things happen there. And not me, man. I'm shooting baskets Saturday night because that sounds way more fun than going out and partying. And so you're playing basketball and you don't perform as well as you want. Well, your teammates, this floor, they didn't mop it very well. It was slippery. The referees, if they would just call all the fouls, I'm fouled like on every play, And I realized after a while that I couldn't do anything about all those circumstances. And so I started changing the way I would play basketball. It really did change because, well, if I'm not going to get the call, then I need to keep playing as if I'm not going to get the call. Because if you think you're fouled, you act like if you've been hurt and you stop playing and, no. And then it became a challenge that I'm going to bulldoze my way to the basket because if they're not going to call fouls, well, that works both ways. And playing sports helped me stop blaming the uncontrollable aspects of the sport and just
become
what
better.
Can I do about it?
The first example I thought I was going to bring up was someone I knew some time ago who he was on his, I don't know the exact number, fourth or fifth job after several in a row. And in every case, his boss, just that job, my boss this, my boss that, this. Well, somehow every time he was fired or had to quit, it was because of the boss. It's like, there's one common denominator in all of those jobs, and it's not the boss. That keeps changing. But that's more in line with what we're talking about blaming other people. Actually, an example I saw online that I really appreciated recently was, there's so many passionate parents talking to schools these days, talking to school boards, because they see what's going on in their schools and they're concerned for their kids. And it's a variety of things. And the video I saw the other day, it was a black mother who was upset about the critical race theory themed education that her son was getting. And why she was concerned as a black woman was that she saw the message that this was communicating to him, that you can't succeed because of outside circumstances.
Mhm.
You're in a difficult place because of outside circumstances. You are essentially a helpless victim because of outside circumstances. And we've got to, and versus all the stories of people that, there are those who were born in poverty and rose above it versus those who are born in poverty and that's their excuse for never doing anything. And she didn't want her son learning those things. She wasn't necessarily contesting that the past has been difficult and that maybe there are barriers that her son might face that other people wouldn't face. But she wanted an education for her son that taught him to focus on what he can do and how you can rise above, and not dependent on somehow the world to literally change before you can actually succeed in life and build a family and have success.
Develop a mindset of overcoming.
Absolutely. Versus the mindset she saw, which was blaming.
Right.
Teaching her child to blame the world for whatever difficulties he would face, because the world, until Christ fixes it, is never going to be a place that's perfect. It's like someone said once, it's like sitting at a green light because you see the light down the road is still red, and waiting for all the lights on the street to be green at the same time. Saying, well, I can't go because I'm just going to have to stop up there. It's like, well, you can go a little bit. You can do something. The person who's still sitting there on the road blaming the street for having occasional red lights is just not going to go anywhere.
Right.
So that's a different element of blame. And I think of two circumstances about this, and maybe they only relate partially, but to me they do move me to not focus on my circumstances as much, and even to flip it around and think, no, maybe the circumstances are purposeful. They're the reason I need to act. And one of them, we need to bring out disclaimer guy, because it's going to involve actually something that the fictional character Gandalf says to the fictional character Frodo. So I want to make sure people understand we're not endorsing these commonly experienced fictional works. We've all got to judge those things, but let's hear from disclaimer guy to make this plain.
Any discussion that follows should not be considered an endorsement of the subject of that discussion, unless the subject is the Bible. We endorse that big time.
Thank you, disclaimer guy. So here's the quote, and without going into all the circumstances, because again, we're not trying to say that you should read all of this, but I have to admit, I was exposed to this quote even before ever being exposed to any of the fictional material, and I just thought the principle there is fantastic. So you have the character Frodo, who is bothered by the circumstance in which he finds himself,
Which is fair.
Which is fair, because the world really is terrible, and there's a terrible burden on him. And he says that given what was going on, he says, I wish it need not have happened in my time. Like, you wish these terrible things, like imagine being in London during the bombing of World War II and these circumstances. You just wish, I wish it could have been some other time and some other person. And the response from the wise old man, in this case, someone named Gandalf, because he's also living through it, and he says, so do I, and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. And I just think it's
almost go in the Bible.
Oh man, well, okay, let me switch to that. So that's why, and we don't need a disclaimer guy for this at all. To me, it reflects a bit Mordecai and Esther, because Esther finds herself in a terrible spot where her people are potentially about to be slaughtered, and the one thing that might be the thing to do is for her to risk her own life and to go before the king and take an action that really normally would have resulted in execution. And man, if you understood royalty back then, there was no guarantee that was going to be a merciful execution, if you will. But to go before the king, and so she's worried about that. And Mordecai advises her that, perhaps you were born for a time such as this. Like, to me, those two, the fictional statements and Mordecai's advice are connected in that don't waste time fretting on how you wish circumstances were different. Of course, we wish the circumstances were different. Rather, embrace the fact that you are in this time and move forward. In fact, God is watching maybe he actually has engineered this circumstance for the very purpose of you standing and doing the thing that you are about to do. And so I've taken from those ideas in my life that there's just no benefit in fretting about the circumstances in which I find myself and constantly blaming those circumstances for my faults or these missteps. You know what? The circumstances I can't control. I can control me. And I wish I could say I've always done that perfectly, but I just haven't. We do want to summarize the things we're trying to say, and then very briefly just talk about the very simple thing of how to fix all of this.
Wait, you're not going to read that section of Esther?
Oh, no, I was just going to refer to it. I
Okay.
wasn't going to read it. But hey, let me encourage all of you out there to read it. Do you know what chapter it is, Mr. Robinson? We could advise them where to find it.
If we're on the same page, you're talking about the section in Esther 4, chapter 4. They find out something terrible is going to happen to the Jews, and Mordecai tells Esther what's going on and recommends a course of action. Esther, they're corresponding, sends back and says, "Hey, that's pretty high risk." She says more than that, but her life was on the line because you couldn't appear before the king unless he called for you. And if he didn't lift his scepter and accept you, you're going to die. So,
Right.
So it was a risk for her. But I think we could at least read Mordecai's response because it's
okay.
kind of Gandalf-like.
I got it.
Okay.
I got it here. Do you want to read it, or I can read
No,
it?
no, go ahead. It's your
Yeah,
story.
All right. Yeah, I can never fault Mr. Robinson for loving the Bible. The man loves the Bible. All right, verse 14 of Esther 4. I'm just going.
You have to start.
You want to start at the very
13.
beginning?
No,
All right,
no,
verse.
Just start
13.
at verse 13.
Verse 13? Okay, I'll start in verse 13. So Mordecai, it says in verse 13 of Esther 4, Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" How's that?
Yeah, no, it's
performance, Mr.
good.
Robinson?
Give me chills.
Oh, hey, that's what I was going for. Give me my Oscar now. Just don't let Will Smith smack me.
Oh,
All right. So points to make. There's 3 ways in which I felt we should highlight that focusing on blame poisons your thinking. The first one, when we're caught up in blaming others and blaming circumstances, we become blinded to our own faults. Even if it's true, even if, yes, your brother did that and he never should have done that, or your sister, or your wife, or your husband, or your boss, or the weather, whatever it is, even if those things are true, if we get in the habit of blaming external forces, we become blinded to our own faults.
And furthermore, if you never correct this and you continue to practice it, like in the more extreme version where you're really blinded to your own faults and you refuse to accept them, not only do you get more and more embedded into that mindset as you get older, but you get more and more blind. And you get to a point later in your life where you're very unrealistic about yourself. Now you're not getting along with other people because you're not seeing the things that other people see and they're problematic. You just slowly become more and more difficult to deal with and to reason with because you're blinded by your own faults and it's what you've practiced for so much of your life, and you just become increasingly bitter and resentful because nobody wants to be around you.
Right. So don't. So there's that kind of person who just is constantly negative about all the other circumstances, and that if it weren't for all these other circumstances, all these other people, they would be just fine. Is, if you really think about that, it's not a person you really enjoy spending any time around. A second way that it poisons your mind, and this is what I think was bothering the young mother that I referred to in my example, it trains you to adopt a victim mindset. And what I mean by this is, even if you do recognize that you're at fault in some things, you begin to adopt a mindset where you're helpless to do anything about it. My wife actually highlighted, as we were discussing these things, like I mentioned earlier, that there was a time, I don't know if it was back in the 80s or when it really kicked in. I know that we tend to notice it in the 80s because you're growing up and notice the way people talk, that there was this big trend to try to encourage people to blame their problems on their parents. Like, so how did your mother raise you? What form of punishment did they use in the house? Well, you know what? Our parents do influence us. That's definitely true. Now, was it to the extent the kind of pop psychologists and stuff we're talking about, or maybe real psychologists in the 80s, where literally your own life is not in your control in any way whatsoever, and essentially you're just this innocent, had nothing to do with it, victim of how you were raised in all circumstances? Well, no, that's ridiculous. Definitely, our parents make a difference in our lives. In fact, otherwise, why parent, right? But that's our
Right.
goal, is to make a difference. And that difference is both a mixture of positive and negative, because parents are certainly human beings who don't do everything right. But at the same time, there's a mentality that you can adopt where, well, if everything boils down to how your mother did something, or your father, well, then you become this helpless victim, and you really can't change. Because you know what you can't do is go back and change how you were reared. You can't go back and change whatever mistakes were made in the past. All you have is the present and the life you're living in now. And if we get caught up in blaming other things, we begin to adopt this mindset that we just can't change anything.
Right. You know, this reminds me, because especially for some reason you putting the 1980s in there, because I primarily think of myself as a creature of the 80s. And that's when I went to middle school and high school.
Mm-hmm.
And man, who knows what all led me to finally break free of this thinking, but I really did follow for this kind of victim mindset when I was late teens, early 20s. And so I thought, well, okay. So when I was 18, my parents moved out of state, and I didn't want to move out of state, so I stayed where I was. And after a while, that wasn't going very well. And so then the next thing you know, I've moved out of state, and I get to the new state, and immediately things don't go well. And so I think, well, this place is no good. So I moved to another place, and I moved to another place.
Wow.
Then in the summer, I moved to another place. And then finally, there was this one.
Like a drifter, man. It's like a TV show.
Well, I forget this now. Now, some of it was moving because, you lived with somebody for a while, and then you got an apartment. So it wasn't always because I was moving to escape. But at one point, I counted up, I had moved 19 times between the time I was age 18 and 21 or 22.
Wow.
22 maybe. So finally, I think, no. See, the problem is this state was too cold. This state didn't have any cool people in it. Lots of reasons why my life was not going well. And so finally, I'm going to move back to my home state, and not just anywhere, but into the glorious, how do I want to put it? The Shangri-La of Austin, Texas. So I moved there. Guess what, Smith? Things don't go great at first. And I remember thinking, I think it was probably the same time. I thought, Austin's not working out like I thought. This isn't the place I thought it was going to be. I'm going to move to another place. And then that's when it really hit me. And it really did change my life. And I'm thankful. I'm going to give God the credit that he helped me kind of get to this point. And don't forget that sometimes in your life you go through very difficult times to bring you to a point where you have a realization.
Yes.
And make a change. I realized that if I wasn't happy here in Austin, I wasn't going to be happy anywhere. And the common denominator in all these stops, all these weather issues, all these other people was me.
You are the only common element in all those circumstances.
I could move to whatever new city was going to solve all my problems. And unfortunately, the problem is that I was moving there with me. And that was it. And I actually thought, okay, Robinson, you've got to clean this up, and I did, and I slowly but surely started making better decisions, sticking to things like was a big part of it. To stick with something, start developing some stability, and I did, and then my life took off from there. And one thing I might mention, especially if let's say you're younger and you really do feel like, man, there's just so many things out of control of my life that I have no control over. Well, that's true, but it may not be as true as you think. And I remember when I was 22, and it just hit me, and this is more obvious to some than others, I think, when they're younger. Wow, I have actually a lot of control over my life. This thing I think I don't have control over, I do have control over that. I can make a change. Sometimes it's just as simple as you remove yourself from a situation where there's an influence that you think is not good, and you get rid of it.
Right. You didn't have the power to change all of them, so you just move yourself someplace else.
Exactly. We talked about that a little bit, I think, in one of our very recent podcasts. I had to move on from a group of friends because
you mentioned that.
Yeah. So it was an eye-opening time for me. And then as life has gone on, just not only no regrets, but then you start studying the Bible and you've seen people like Cain in that mindset, and you think, yep, I was
Yeah.
there for a little while, and that's a huge trap. And if you don't fix it, you will have a miserable life.
Wow. So that's two things, two ways it poisons the poisonous power of blame. Maybe that would be the title. I'll work on that. One, you become blinded to your own faults. Two, it trains you to adopt a victim mindset when deep down you are the only thing you can control. And then the third thing, before we talk about the simple way to fix it, is that over time it trains you to hate the things you blame. Think about Cain and Abel. How much has to grow within you to the point that you're actually, especially you're literally inventing murder. You know, I mean, the devil did it first in the sense that his influence would cause mankind to die. But however, here you have Cain essentially come up with, hey, you know what? I'm going to take this thing and I'm going to make my brother dead. That's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
It
seems like an extreme solution. Surely we could have worked something out.
That's right. The more you say you blame your parents all the time, or you blame your sibling all the time, or you blame your spouse all the time, or you blame the world all the time, you know what? You do that long enough, you will come to detest those things, because after a while, I think you start believing the lie, right? And
Yep.
and next thing you know, that is an abhorrent person or thing or circumstance. And you know, it's interesting because, and I actually would mind just jumping right into how to fix it about that,
Yep,
because there's
let's
an
do it.
example I want to
And
connect
I
to.
love, there's a lot of examples you could have picked. And this is such an interesting one. I really liked it. I put that in the notes, by the way.
Ah, good. Okay, good. In the time we have left, what do you do? Well, one, just stop blaming things. You own it. Own what you can. Own your own behavior and embrace that you have made these mistakes, or that you are not perfect, or that you have a character flaw. Own it so you can work on it and trust God with the rest. There's at least several points I want to make. I might actually, the example that Mr. Robinson said he liked, I might reserve that one for him, because I'm glad he liked that one. I wanted, because I was going to mention this earlier with Adam, but I want to highlight the extreme version of owning what you can is Jesus Christ. Because unlike Adam, who did sin and didn't own it, Jesus Christ didn't sin at all, and yet he owned everything. He didn't have his sins to own, but instead he owned mine and Mr. Robinson's and yours sitting there. He owned the sins of the world, even though none of them, not a single one of them, was his. And in the end, that was part of how our price could be paid, because then he was able to die for all of those sins that in the end we have really committed. And so I'm not saying that's what you shouldn't own your neighbor's sins in this current way, but at the same time, there is a human analog to this that I do find interesting. And it actually is in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 9, for instance. I'm not going to read examples there, but because it's actually a lot of them. And there's a little bit of speculation here, because in terms of just how righteous was Daniel before they went into captivity, because we know he was righteous after captivity. He and his friends, they don't eat the trash from the king. His friends don't worship the idol.
He was a legend in his own time.
He
He was
definitely
referenced by other prophets.
He was, as one of the three most righteous men in the Old Testament. I think that Daniel's behavior after the captivity argues that he was obedient before the captivity, one, because one seems to follow the other. And Jesus Christ tells us that those who are faithful in those things that are least are also the ones that are faithful in that which is much. So I think it very much does point to the fact that Daniel was faithful before the captivity, because how could he be so faithful in the hard times if he hadn't already learned to be faithful in the easy times? So that's a little speculative, but I highlight it because when you read Daniel's prayer to God in Daniel chapter 9, he's talking about, why they're in captivity. He's talking about the sins of his people, but he uses the plural first person we and our. He talks about our sins and how we have sinned against you and we have been unrighteous. And his willingness to identify with his own people and to humbly speak of it when he was probably one striving not to do those things during that time. I try to remember to do that, and I got to be honest, I do fall short. But when I'm praying for my country, sometimes I don't often enough ask God to just forgive us as Americans, and take Daniel's attitude that, see, these are my people, these are my brothers too, these are all of us, and then we as a people have failed you. So I'm not saying, because some people will take they'll blame themselves for other people's wrongs. And we shouldn't do that. We're not talking about owning things that aren't yours. But still, I see the fact that, how did Christ solve the problem of us being guilty? He actually was willing to own everything and didn't come to hate the ones who are the actual source of the problems, which is us. So how do you fix blaming? Well, you just stop doing it and ask God for the help to own the things that are actually yours. And I thought David's was a good example. Is that the one you're referring to, Mr. Robinson, the one you commented on?
Yeah, no, I thought that was good.
Yeah, because he wasn't in a place where he was doing that, but then God brought him to a place where he was.
Well, he had to be he had to get a different perspective. The story was related to him as a parable, and his reaction.
King David?
Yeah, King David. So, okay, I think we can quickly recap that story.
So we're over an hour, so that would be good if we quickly recap.
We'll quickly recap. You have a situation where David's army is at war and out fighting, and he does not go with them, and he stays back in Jerusalem.
Is King David.
King David.
Not my son David, just so you know.
Yes,
that was dumb.
That's a good thing we clarified that. And King David sees a desirable woman, has her brought over, gets her pregnant, and then realizes
she's a married woman. It's also important to say it wasn't just a.
Well, I was going to say has her wife killed to cover it up, because has her husband killed to cover it up. And by all accounts, he was an honorable man. So it was a bad scene all the way around. And everybody's aware that this has occurred. Like it's not hidden in the palace what's been done. So, but David still hasn't recognized fully his fault in it until Nathan the prophet comes to him and relates this parable of essentially what would happen if a really rich man went to a poor man and took the only lamb he had and killed it, instead of taking all from his vast resources. And David's righteous, he's rightly indignant about this and says,
that guy should die.
That guy should die, and he should be, restore fourfold. And Nathan springs it on him and says, that man is you, David, and then reports what God said. One thing that's kind of interesting is, up till now, David has corresponded directly with God from time to time, and this time God won't even correspond with him, since Nathan. I just think that's
that's fascinating. He has to send a prophet like he'd send to any other sinning king of Israel.
Right, exactly.
Wow.
So in this case, that's another little indication that David. In fact, another thing I might mention very quickly. It's interesting when God forgives him and says, "Well, don't worry, you're not going to die." You realize that he could have been killed was on the table. That's how egregious the sin was. But what your point is, and was David's response. So he hears this, he hears what God says, and he doesn't say, well, come on, I'm the king. He doesn't make excuses. He just said, so David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And that's it. And there's more. God strikes the child so that it would die. David fasts and hopes that maybe God will change his mind. God doesn't. But at no time does he, from that point on, he just owns what he's done.
Yeah.
And you referenced Psalm 51 here, where I think he goes on and describes in more detail, how sorry he was and what deep repentance it brought on him.
Absolutely. We sing it in our hymn book in the church. It's what's the name of the hymn? It's in thy loving kindness, Lord, right? Be merciful to me.
Don't we even sing that after Passover?
We often do. I think different pastors do different songs, but yeah, we sing that, and it's really David's psalm of owning it, not making excuses. He makes no excuses. He says, I sinned against you. He's very upfront about it. You had me read Esther. I won't read all of this to be sure, but this is one of my favorite lines in the whole Bible. The story's in 2 Samuel 12, and after he's told David the story of the guy with the lamb and the little baby lamb, and instead the rich guy kills it, and David's furious, and he's already said, this man shall die. And it's one of my favorites is Nathan says to David in verse 7, you are the man. Mm-hmm. I don't know why, just the simplicity of it. It's like he's just fallen into God's trap, and he's loathing this man, and then to come find out he is the man. I don't know. It always moves me to just when I read those words, you are the man. But Exactly what you just mentioned in terms of the strength of owning it and how it opens up God to be able to rectify the situation. David always has troubles, but he will still be king in Israel in the millennium. His resurrection is still ahead, because when what you referred to was in verses 13 and 14, 2 Samuel 12, it says, David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And then Nathan said to David, the Lord has also has put away your sin, you shall not die. Until he heard Nathan say that the Eternal was not going, he will not die. What was David confessing to in verse 13? It was a executable offense.
He's
it was
worthy of
adultery.
death.
He is worthy of death. And David didn't wait to hear, look, buddy, just fess up. If you just fess up, I'll forgive you. Just fess up and you're not going to die. In fact, he's been convicted of the fact that he should die through the example. He out of his own mouth, he has declared the fact that he should die. And in that light, that's still what's on the table. That's actually the thing you would expect in this circumstance. That's when David owns it and says, I have sinned. I deserve to die. Maybe he was about to, as far as he knows. Maybe that's going to be it, and of course he does not. And that's part of the power of owning it. We're told in 1 John chapter 1 and verse 9, it's a fundamental truth about having a relationship with God. And it involves confessing your sins before him. Appearing before God, not hiding from him like Adam and Eve tried to do with clothes, not trying to run away like Jonah did, fleeing when God called him to do something difficult. But when you're kneeling there before God and he sees you for everything you truly are, and you are a person with sins, you're a person who makes mistakes, you're a person who makes wrong choices sometimes, and just owning it there in front of God and asking for his forgiveness and for his help to change, that is a fundamental element of having any real relationship with your Creator at all. And so that's part of why in this season, as Passover and the days of unleavened bread are coming, we're told by Paul that these are days in which we should examine ourselves. And if we're going to examine ourselves in our relationship before God, then we would recommend with this podcast that examining our propensity to blame others for our choices and our mistakes instead of just owning them before God, which is at the heart of having a healthy relationship with him, is one of the most profitable things we can examine ourselves for.
Smith and Robinson.